Je remercie bien sûr tous les organisateurs pour m'avoir demandé de participer à ce travail extrêmement intéressant et important. Et je pense que le choix du Maroc est un bon choix parce que nous avons une bonne volonté politique de très haut niveau en termes d'eau, de changement climatique et évidemment les impacts des questions d'aridité et de désertification, nous les connaissons aussi. Et je voudrais quand même m'interroger. Donc, je m'interroge sur est-ce que le droit de l'environnement intègre tous les aspects reliés à la question de l'eau et inversement, est-ce que tous les systèmes juridiques reliés à l'eau intègrent la question de la protection de l'environnement? C'est une question que je me pose. Je crois que la question de l'eau est beaucoup plus vaste et intègre des questions et des secteurs qui sont beaucoup plus importants que ce que comporte le droit de l'environnement. L'eau a des fonctions et, in fine, bien sûr, je reviens sur ce qui a été dit auparavant, la question de l'effectivité de ce droit, mais une effectivité peut-être tournée vers le droit à l'eau. Parce que, in fine, qu'est-ce que nous faisons? C'est de faire le nécessaire pour que tout le monde ait accès à l'eau, que ce soit les personnes ou les personnes morales. Parce que aujourd'hui, nous travaillons en ce qui concerne la question de l'eau sur les usages et sur la en même temps, je suis interpellée par le retard du droit international par rapport à la question de l'eau. Bien sûr, il y a les principes, la coutume, etc. Il y a plusieurs traités et conventions. Il y a la Convention sur les cours d'eau internationaux. Mais nous manquons quand même d'une convention cadre dans l'esprit de Rio qui puisse prendre la question de l'eau dans une perspective de développement durable et lui accorder et mettre en place le mécanisme pour permettre une évolution du cadre juridique international et d'un mécanisme de gouvernance. Tout cela nous manque en matière de l'eau. En même temps, je voudrais poser une autre question, peut-être que nous pourrons y revenir plus tard. Quelle coopération intra-africaine et dans quel cadre de gouvernance? Il y a une tendance à la mise en commun, il y a des organismes qui se mettent en place ou qui intègrent la question de l'eau et qui ont déjà intégré la question des changements climatiques ou de l'environnement. La question de l'eau est venue un peu plus tard, mais avec quel cadre juridique, avec quelle responsabilité est-ce que nous sommes réellement dans un cadre intégrateur, suffisamment intégrateur, intégrateur en termes de pays, mais aussi en termes de secteur? La question de l'eau longtemps a été centralisée, puis ensuite il y a eu l'arrivée de la société civile, heureusement, et ensuite nous avons bien sûr le cadre universitaire. Le secteur privé est arrivé en retard, mais le secteur privé est à clarifier parce qu'il ne s'agit pas des gestionnaires de l'eau, il s'agit du secteur privé ou du secteur économique qui a besoin d'eau et qui a besoin d'une efficacité hydrique, mais en même temps, quelle est la responsabilité des uns et des autres dans le cadre de cette gouvernance de l'eau, que ce soit au niveau local, national ou international. Donc, la durabilité, comment penser l'eau et l'environnement dans le cadre d'une économie circulaire, peut-être la valorisation des ressources naturelles, la démographie, il y a énormément de questionnements. Et à partir de là, je voudrais tout de suite donner la parole. Je m'excuse si je ne prononce pas suffisamment bien votre nom à l'avance pour une introduction du professeur et juge Emmanuel Ugirashebuja, et que j'ai eu du plaisir à lire votre biographie parce que j'ai eu du plaisir à lire votre biographie parce que vous avez la connaissance, l'expérience de terrain et l'aspect justiciabilité qui est en fait le grand manquant dans tout ce qui est effectivité de l'eau, du droit de l'eau ou du droit à l'eau. Vous avez la parole, monsieur le professeur.
Merci beaucoup, Madame Sadeq. And thank you everyone for these excellencies, justices, colleagues, dear friends, all protocols observed. It is a privilege to be invited to deliver these introductory remarks on this very important theme on environment, environmental law, water, and climate change, general trends and challenges in Africa. I will begin by this well-renowned saying in Africa that once you carry your water, you will learn the value of water. So water is a very valuable commodity for us here in Africa. We were told about the statistics of water in Africa, but again, it seems to be the driest part of the world. According to an author who I really admire, known as Kate Raworth, in her book, Donut Economics, 7 Ways to Think Like a 21st Century Economist, she says, this is an economic era that has come to be known as the Great Acceleration, thanks to its extraordinary surge in human activity. Between 1950 and 2010, the global population almost trebled, and this is including Africa, and real world GDP increased 7-fold worldwide. Freshwater use more than trebled, energy use increased 4-fold, and fertilizer use rose over 10-fold. These statistics also captured Africa, especially when you look at the issue of global population in Africa, which has also almost trebled. Here in Africa, just like everywhere else, water is our means of support. It impacts on almost every part of our lives. It affects our health, our economy, as well as our environment. It is vital to the food we eat and the goods we produce, especially here in Africa, where we rely on rainfall in order to produce the food that we eat. Unfortunately, humanity use of water disregards the fact that the supply is limited. Water is wasted even though the supply of fresh water is both finite and threatened. Compound overconsumption with aging water supply infrastructure, pollution and climate change, and we are encountering an unprecedented stress on our fresh water, and this is more so here in Africa. Water and weather, the delicate balance between evaporation and precipitation is the primary circle through which climate change is felt. As our climate changes, droughts, floods, melting glaciers, sea level rise, and storms intensify or alter, often with very severe consequences, as we've seen here in Africa. The statistics show that only 3% of the planet's water is fresh water. And of this, 2/3 is captured in glaciers and polar ice. So we have a very small percentage here in Africa of water, fresh water, which is also depleting, as we heard from previous speakers. In the current climate predictions, safeguarding the water we have in the supplies we need for a global population set to reach 10 billion, and I believe 2 billion in Africa, will be a challenging task. When you look at very important reports such as the World Economic Forum report, it ranks water crisis as #1, especially here in Africa, and in its assessment of global risks, with potential to cause damaging economic and social impacts across entire countries and sectors. And Africa is not excluded from this analysis. Living with climate change will mean coping with the impacts of water, whether too much or too little sometimes, and taking the necessary steps to reduce the vulnerabilities of communities and economies. Climate change impacts will have a direct consequence for water security here in Africa. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, has alerted the global community to the great vulnerability of freshwater resources as a result of climate change. There's a recent research by the International Food Policy Research Institute that has found that 4.8 billion people, that is more than half the world's population, and especially those situated in Africa, and approximately half of the global grain production, will be at risk due to water stress by 2050 if business continues to be as usual. There is a very interesting study which was made by Robert J. Nichols, a professor of coastal engineering and a PhD researcher, a BAS Kebede from the University of Southampton, which concluded that in less than 5 decades is the time that it will take for the coastal floods to wipe Dar es Salaam off the map. Dar es Salaam is the capital city of Tanzania, and especially the areas known as Temeke and Kinondoni, due to climate change. So according to this study, there will be too much water, but no one to drink it and probably not suitable for human consumption. Very recently, I was following a Tanzanian television interview, and one of the farmers stated as follows, and I quote him, my harvest this year will be half that of last 2 years. It is no longer viable to cultivate. I do think that this will be sentiments shared by all the farmers, most of the farmers here in Africa, because of the shortage of rainfalls nowadays. Climate change poses disadvantageous and tremendous risks to especially certain vulnerable communities living in most parts of Africa due to raising sea levels, longer dry seasons and shorter wet seasons as have been experienced by the farmers that I just discussed. It has been scientifically predicted that certain coastal states such as Dar es Salaam that I talked about will be wiped off the world map if nothing is done, and very quickly. Climate change in some regions in Africa has aggravated conflict over scarce water and could well trigger large-scale migration in the decades ahead. And rising sea levels put at risk the very survival of some of the small islands states here in Africa, as well as obviously many other developing countries. If we do nothing about the climate change problem, we can count on worldwide disruptions, and especially again here in Africa, in food production, resulting in mass migration, refugee crisis, and increased conflicts over scarce natural resources, such as water and farmland. The issue of adverse impacts of climate change and its effect on water is no longer about our children's children. You remember that the rationale for protection of the environment a few years ago was so that we bequeath the future generation with a livable environment. This kind of rationale, though noble, did not create a sense of urgency. The catchphrases such as IBG and YBG, which mean I will be gone or you will be gone when the bill is due, are no longer applicable. This is about us. This is about the world we and our children will inhabit for the rest of our lives. What is very striking is how insistent some of the world's best scientists have been warning us that climate change, and especially water crisis, desertification and biodiversity loss, are happening faster with bigger impacts than they anticipated just a few years ago. If we are guided by science, chances are that we can salvage the situation. There is a faulty narrative, especially in developing countries, and I've had it here in Africa as well, wherever I've interacted with either my students or even policymakers, that development and protection of the environment are two conflicting concepts. I really do beg to differ with that faulty narrative. If we correct this false assumption, humanity race will move forward in harmony with nature. Development which is sustainable can be achieved by adopting policies, laws, and technologies which are environmental friendly. One of my favorite authors, Simon Sinek, who is a British American author, has eloquently said that it wasn't too long ago that the majority of people believed the world was flat. This perceived truth impacted behavior. During this period, there was very little exploration. People feared that if they traveled too far, they might fall off the edge of the earth. So for the most part, they stayed put. It wasn't until the minor detail was revealed that the world is round, that behaviors changed on massive scale. Upon this discovery, societies began to traverse the planet, trade routes were established, spices were traded. I'm sure my friend Justice Antonio Benjamin is an expert on spices as well. And new ideas like mathematics were shared between societies, which unleashed all kinds of innovation and advancements. This correction of a simple false assumption moved the human race forward. So I do believe that if we correct this false assumption that development and protection of environment are two conflicting concepts, then the human race will really move forward in a way that is in harmony with nature. Excellencies, justices, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, let me conclude by saying this, conclude these introductory remarks by saying this. The future is not what it used to be. It bristles with new challenges. But I also am very optimistic that this generation, with all its energy, questioning, new perspectives, and potential for innovation, is well placed to meet the challenges that we face as humanity. The ongoing efforts of the IUCN, World Commission on Environmental Law, to provide a forum for cooperation, collaboration, constructive debate, as well as effective interchange of views on important themes on environment protection are very impressive. It is a great endeavor you all undertake, and I do take this opportunity to wish you well with it. Thank you very much for your attention. Now I will leave it to the experts in this high-level discussion to discuss pertinent issues on this theme. Thank you very much.
Très bien. Bien, alors je donne la parole au professeur Pedi Obani de l'Université de Bradford, Nigeria. Vous avez la parole, professeur.
Thank you. I'm especially grateful to the organizers for putting this together. I'm also thankful to the IUCN, World Commission on Environmental Law, the United Nations Environment Programme, the Mohammed VI Foundation for Environmental Protection for the invitation to be here. Building on the keynote address that we've been given, I completely agree with the fact that environmental protection and development indeed can go hand in hand. And when we think about, for instance, the human right to sanitation and various other aspects of environmental protection, we find that indeed, if these are not achieved, then development will remain an illusion. At the same time, we find that underdevelopment or lack of development presents a very important challenge to achieving environmental goals. So essentially, there's a synergistic relationship there's a synergy between environmental protection and development in different spheres. For my intervention, I'd like to present on environmental law or the environmental rule of law as enabling this synergy from three perspectives. One perspective is that of environmental law as an enabler. The second perspective is that of environmental law as a people and nature-centric approach. And the third perspective is that of how environmental law actually works in practice. And within these three perspectives, I'll be discussing the challenges first and then the trends. Now, the reason I'm thinking of going with the challenges first is because I think that with the trends that are visible from the developments in different African countries and advances in environmental law, there is actually some positive movements towards this goal of achieving sustainable development and environmental protection. So I'll start with the challenges first, and I'll discuss these challenges again within those three perspectives. So first, with environmental law as an enabler, I'm essentially using that to mean that through environmental law, we have a very good opportunity of addressing the structural causes of environmental degradation, the structural causes of water pollution, the structural causes of climate change, anthropocentric climate change. Now, within that context, I would say that one of the main challenges we have is insufficient data. Now, I've heard a lot of figures being mentioned this afternoon, and I'm sure that we've encountered a lot of figures in the literature about how much resources we have in terms of water, Africa's vulnerability to climate change, and so many other aspects of environmental protection. But I still like to think that we have insufficient data. Because if we think about it, the data needs to be essentially homegrown, right? It needs to come from African institutions. It needs to come from African people. It needs to reflect the realities on the ground. Because if you have a situation where the data is coming from external agencies and being challenged by local people, then already that creates a problem for compliance with environmental law, or compliance with environmental policy informed by such data. If I ask the question, how much water is used for bathing in Africa? Of course, Africa isn't homogeneous. We would have different countries, different localities, different experiences. So issues around how much water resources do we have? And the figures we have, are they accepted by local people? Are they accepted by different stakeholders in the different countries or not? Because if people are skeptical about the data, if they are skeptical about the information, that already creates a problem for compliance with the resulting environmental laws. So one of the challenges I see to environmental law as an enabler for that synergy between development and environmental protection is insufficient data. Another aspect is environmental law as a people and nature-centric approach. Now, within this context, environmental law presents a very good opportunity for protecting the rights of people and protecting the rights of nature. Again, within that context, what is the challenge that I see? I see examples of environmental law actually being used to achieve the opposite, in the sense that when we look at the text of environmental laws, in some cases, we find laws that achieve purposes that actually violate human rights and violates the rights of nature. I'll give an example. So if we have a situation where a law providing for, let's say, access to water creates a distinction between provision in formal areas, where such formal areas are prioritized for provision, and then informal areas or slums or informal settlements are removed from the network for water provision. That in itself creates a problem. It creates a problem because the rights of the people to access the basic water services is already being violated. Secondly, it pushes people to look for alternatives, which inadvertently cause more problems for the environment and water systems. So in that sense, the law is there. The law may have its motivations as ensuring conservation or as ensuring that there's a change in people's behaviors. But if it isn't couched in a way that is at the same time respectful and responsive to people's rights and nature rights, then it becomes a challenge for compliance. Again, sometimes you have environmental laws that impose obligations on people to protect the environment without ensuring that they have the resources required to comply. Another example I could give from the aspect of sanitation is if you have a law that says there should be no littering in public places, and then people are in public places, but there are no bins provided for them to drop the waste. Or you have a law that says there should be no open urination or open defecation. yet we do not have public toilets in public spaces. There's a disconnect already. And that disconnect has implications even for the rights of the people involved. Their rights to health, their dignity, right to adequate standard of living, well-being, and all of those things. So essentially, environmental law can, as a challenge, actually impose restrictions or actually violates the rights of people and the rights of nature. And this is something that needs to be properly addressed in order to ensure that the full potential of the environmental rule of law is achieved in countries and places. Thirdly, from the perspective of environmental law in practice, essentially this is about looking at how the law translates from the text or the decisions of the courts into actually influencing institutions, influencing people's behaviors, and achieving the set objectives on ground. Again, within that context, the challenge that I see there is there's a power asymmetry among stakeholders. And now I use power asymmetry loosely to include the inequality, the imbalance, not only in power in terms of controlling processes, but also the inequality in access to other resources, such as finances, such as knowledge, such as technical capacity. Now, when we look at, for instance, issues around climate change litigation, and we see this, for instance, with the cases from Nigeria, you find litigants going to courts in Europe in order to seek justice against multinational companies, for instance. That's all well and good. But then the question I ask myself is, how many local people can actually afford to litigate climate change cases abroad? And in that sense, if these people who are able to go to international courts or who are able to go to courts in foreign jurisdictions get justice, does that actually improve, first, the jurisprudence in Nigeria? Secondly, does it improve the climate action? Because at the end of the day, those judgments are very often centered around the individual rights of litigants. So in that sense, you find that, yes, the local people in those host communities where oil exploration is occurring have been disenfranchised. But essentially, it is those who still have more resources, who still have a voice, that are able to get justice. So in that sense, there has to be a way of ensuring that environmental law translates from black and white letters in books, in the codes, to actually influencing action positively in terms of protecting people and the planet. So these three challenges I see as things that are to be taken into consideration in designing this framework for promoting environmental rule of law going forward. And like I said, I would like to do the trends next, because I think that, again, there are positive trends which show that it's not all gloom. Now, discussing these trends within those three frameworks, if I go back to environmental law as an enabler, definitely one of the trends which I see as a positive is this decentralization in the process of environmental governance. So for instance, we have sub-regional networks of people, of governments, of various stakeholders. We have, for instance, the Lake Chad Governors Forum. We have other such similar networks, which can actually be a catalyst for improving access to data, for generating the needed data to improve environmental governance. Secondly, regional frameworks such as the African Continental Free Trade Agreements also provide an avenue, because where you have stakeholders from different African countries, especially considering that the problems of environmental degradation and the effects are very often crossing borders. So we can't really just box them up in countries or in states. Very often they're transnational as well. So in that sense, any regional framework or network provides an opportunity for improving the role of environmental law as an enabler for addressing both environmental protection and development objectives. Secondly, when I look at environmental law as a people and nature-centric approach, A trend that I see is the recognition of the rights to environment, but also the rights of nature. So when I look at, for instance, the Ugandan National Environmental Act of 2019, it clearly recognizes the rights of nature. And I think that is a positive that can actually improve environmental rule of law, provided, of course, that the apparent tensions between human rights and the rights to nature are addressed to ensure synergy. Finally, when I think about environmental law in practice, a trend that I see that I think is also a positive is the consolidation of environmental laws as well as consolidation of licensing procedures. So an example from Lagos, Nigeria, for instance, is the Environmental Management and Protection Law of Lagos State, which brings together all the major environmental laws in the state and ensures that there's a clear route of supervision and enforcement. Again, if we look at the case of South Africa, there's the example of the One Environmental System, which simplifies the licensing procedures. So I think all of these are positive trends which can actually be built upon to improve the opportunities which environmental rule of law presents for achieving both environmental protection as well as human development long term. Thank you.
Merci, professeur, pour ce tour d'horizon complet et très pertinent. Je voudrais tout de suite donner... Bien, alors je donne la parole au professeur Robert Kibugi, professeur à l'Université de Nairobi. Je vous en prie, vous avez la parole.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Houria. And thank you very much for the invitation. It's been a pleasure to listen to the conversations this afternoon and also to have been part of the scientific committee and to just see all the good work that the WCL is doing. As following up on my colleagues, I would like to carry on the theme looking at what are some of the challenges, although I think that Justice Emmanuel already covered that area and other speakers quite eloquently, that I may leave out some of the areas that I wanted to talk about. But importantly, I would like to posit that there is a much bigger role that rights can play in the protection of nature and for advancing climate action. And you note that I haven't said human rights because I think that we are now past the point of focusing entirely on human rights. And while they are important and while we must still examine them and expand not just their normative content, but also enforceability, we need to also talk about, for instance, the rights of nature. And I'm glad that Pedi already delved into that conversation because I believe that there is a correlation that we might be missing in moving from ensuring that development is not merely sustainable, but that development is actually ecologically sustainable. And ecologically sustainable development means that even if we are pursuing a balancing of socio-economic, political, as well as environmental considerations, that the ecological integrity, the ability or the protection of ecosystem services is the paramount outcome because of that connectivity. And if I may begin, we do know that the African continent is obviously facing much of the similar environmental and climate change phenomena as with the rest of the world. When it comes to climate change, if we speak in a more high-level sense, the larger problem, of course, is vulnerability, continuing vulnerability of socio-economic and environmental systems to the adverse impacts of climate change. But that vulnerability is made worse by much lower levels of resilience and, in many instances, diminished levels of adaptive capacity. Similarly, problems around, for instance, the degradation of land degradation, biodiversity loss, and land degradation and biodiversity loss have very significant connections to the negative implications on water, both surface water and groundwater. And groundwater often is the poorer cousin in this conversation that is forgotten. And degradation, biodiversity loss, which are made worse by climate change, mean that we no longer have the ability to contain erosion. which impacts surface water, and we have no ability to do natural recharge of aquifers, which means that we indeed continue to lose groundwater resources, and we'll have to resort to very expensive artificial recharges or look for more expensive ways of getting water. In that context, amongst the toolkits that we have for purposes of enhancing the protection of environment, and by so speaking, also protecting human welfare, is a conception of rights and duties. If we begin with human rights, all here, I'm sure we know that human rights are universal, and they place this obligation on the states to respect, protect, and fulfill, a tripartite obligation that is non-negotiable, and most states, from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights to national constitutions and judicial actions, already accept that obligation across, but also in environmental, in terms of environment. For that reason, the right to a clean and healthy environment, wherever it may be recognized, whether as a constitutional right or as a statutory right, is a core tool that carries that tripartite obligation. But this right has two parts. It has the human entitlement to the clean and healthy environment, but that entitlement is pointless if there is no clean and healthy environment. And that environment therefore needs to be protected, and it needs to be healthy in order for it to be enjoyed in various ways that humanity needs to enjoy it. Indeed, the Special Rapporteur for Environment and Human Rights has already affirmed that the enjoyment of not just the human right to a clean and healthy environment, but for all other rights, depends by a large scale on a clean and healthy environment. Now, to this environment, for instance, its health encompasses the ability to perform various functions, but also to provide various ecosystem services, or sometimes we call them environmental services or nature's contribution to humanity. And these include regulating, which is central, for instance, to climate change, or critical life systems like pollination, supporting, which is very critical, for instance, to water, provisioning services that makes it possible for us to get food. And those are the ones that we commonly focus on. But cultural ecosystem services, their utility to human well-being has become acutely notable during the COVID-19 pandemic, as people have been subjected to movement restrictions and lockdowns, and everybody needed to get out, or has needed to get out into an open air space, a public open air space that provides access to clean air, physical distancing, and all other rules that we've been required to observe in that period. And we can see that cumulatively, protecting that element of the environment is important in order for the human entitlement to be protected. My contention here is that whereas the law as it is written has focused a lot, has set out the two, the law in practice has tended to focus too much on the entitlement and forgotten the duty that is required to protect the clean environment. And you see this, for instance, by the same very destructive economic decisions that are being made by the same governments under the same constitutions and authorization that also provides this human right to a clean and healthy environment. Of course, we have seen innovations around, for instance, Africa, and the Uganda Environmental Management Act of 2019 has been spoken of over and over again this afternoon. But what is important is that that act also reaffirms that country's constitutional guarantee of a human right to a clean and healthy environment, but also entrenches a correlative duty on each person to create, maintain, and enhance the environment, including the duty to prevent pollution. Kenya's constitution, in addition to the right to a clean and healthy environment, equally confers a duty on every person to protect the environment and ensure ecologically sustainable development and use of natural resources. So we can see certain trends in that direction. The challenge, of course, being what happens after we put these provisions in statute, and how do they deal with the more dominant public administration elements that have to deal with economic productivity. For instance, how soundly protected or respected will that provision be, whereas where we are considering extraction of minerals or petroleum? And as we know, the story is quite different. If we were to think in a slightly different way and adapt to where we have seen in certain other countries the rights of nature, and in these rights of nature, for instance, Uganda guarantees the right of nature to exist, persist, maintain, and regenerate its vital cycles. But we have also seen other countries like New Zealand have enacted statutes that have given legal personality or equivalent of juridical rights to nature. In New Zealand case, this has involved revocation of protected area status, revocation of crown land status of land, and giving that land outright legal personality, of course, with guardianship roles being conferred on a board of directors or a governing board to be taken in the interest of that protected area. That is where I would like to speak about that connectivity that we are missing between that human entitlement and the need to protect nature. If we look at African philosophy on individual and personality speaks of on personhood, also urges a notion of communitarianism. And many here might know the concept of Ubuntu, which is interpreted loosely to mean I am because we are. But Ubuntu is reflected elsewhere in Africa as Utu in Kiswahili or in various other ways. It just means I am because we are. We are many. And many scholars have advanced this connectivity between individuality and community. Ifeanyi Menkiti from West Africa says personhood is social and it's granted by the community, and priority is given to the duties which individuals owe to collectivity, and their rights, whatever this may be, are seen as secondary as to the exercise of their duties. John Mbiti, a Kenyan religious philosopher, said that the African person can be summed up as I am because we are, and since we are, therefore I am. If nature acquires legal or juridical rights akin to person in the African traditional sense, then as an African community or society, the logical outcome could be that I, in this case nature or human, am because we are, and therefore introducing that connectivity between nature and person because of that equality in the form of rights. And this is also akin to the American forester Aldo Leopold's notion of land ethic, where he argued that man and nature, or humanity and nature, are in a symbiotic relationship of needing each other. So if we look at that connectivity, we can see that it does not exclude the utility of human rights, but it adds an added force of compulsion to ensure that where rights matter, human rights obviously matter, and they have obligations, and the right to a clean and healthy environment does matter. But the rights of nature, although emergent on the continent, can actually enhance a value, ethics, or moral-driven change that is backed by law if nature acquires that Ubuntu status. Of course, this emerging consciousness may trigger the notion that development must be ecologically sustainable. But to conclude, it is important to remember that certain tools that are already in use can be helped to move this further. For instance, in climate change, the most important tool that we have is mainstreaming of climate actions into the dominant economic action, or the value of meaningful and constructive public participation, as well as, because we are all teachers and professors, the teaching of environmental law to build more and more generations of younger people and scholars that understand not just human rights, but the rights of nature. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup pour votre intervention et pour avoir mis sur la table la question des droits de l'homme. Je voudrais préciser que je suis également présidente de la Commission des droits de l'homme Rabat Saleh Kenitra du Conseil national des droits de l'homme et que nous travaillons sur cette question de manière particulière. Pour terminer, le dernier intervenant, je voudrais donner la parole au professeur Wabunoha, qui est coordinateur régional gouvernance environnementale du PNUE. Je suis désolée, je voulais faire passer Madame le professeur en premier et j'ai ensuite enchaîné avec le deuxième intervenant. Donc, je vous donne la parole, sachant que nous sommes presque à la fin du temps qui nous est imparti.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you all the predecessors who have spoken before me. And also thank you, Justice Emmanuel, for introducing this topic of which we are in this first high-level roundtable. I will start with agreeing with Justice Emmanuel that development and environment is in tandem with each other, especially on the African continent. And my focus for discussion today is going to be on the trends in the development of environmental law in Africa, with some little bit of emphasis on water and climate change. As by way of introduction, is that I have 4 points of emphasis. The first one is that Africa's advancement of its socio-economic growth and the containment of its environmental challenges are in tandem with the improvements of its environmental laws at continental, regional, national, and local levels. My second point of emphasis is that there is a correlation between the drivers of environmental, socioeconomic, and political change and the development of environmental laws in Africa. My third contention is that even though African countries are facing a myriad of challenges in safeguarding their natural capital wealth, the trends are that there are great strides which have been made to regulate the environment, water, climate change, and some little bit on desertification. My last point of emphasis is that environmental law in Africa has neither developed or progressed in a vacuum, but is connected to the internal and external forces and pressures, such as climate change, water scarcity, desertification, land and forest degradation, which have played a critical role in the development of environmental law in Africa. And I think throughout what I'm going to say, you will see those trends. If you see the development of environmental law in Africa and its implementation, there are 2 opposing but related drivers which have shaped the environmental law in Africa. The first driver is the need or the quest for safeguarding the natural capital wealth of Africa. We know what Africa has and so on. I will not go into that. But the point is that whereas there is increased global consumption and production, and there is also increased population and economic growth in Africa, those pressures have created a tendency that in most African countries, they are putting in place legal, policy, and institutional safeguards to either use or protect these resources. The second opposing trend or driver is that a number of African countries are faced with environmental loss or losses, and that have in turn put them on pressure, especially for decision makers to formulate regulatory frameworks. And as you can see, the pressures in Africa are coming out of development, infrastructure development, increased agricultural productivity, degradation, and all those other things which we know, including the illegal and illicit trades which are going on. The key issue here is that whereas there are losses of environmental goods and services that have led African states to recognize the significance of healthy ecosystems, the interlinkages with socioeconomic growth, and therefore the need to have laws, policies, and systems that can either stop, maintain, or enhance the availability of these resources for present and future generations. I have been doing some work on looking at trends simply because from the position I sit in United Nations Environment Program, that is a key work of mine to see how the continent is progressing in its development of environmental laws. We all know Africa was colonized, and therefore I will not dwell much on the colonial era in which the legal protection of the environment and natural resources didn't do much help. But however, it suffice to state that the laws during that time were, during that period, both at national and the regional levels, were geared to exploitation for the master's benefit. We cannot forget that colonial era. As we moved on post-independence, African continent started at the beginning, continued with the command and controls legal systems, which were not very beneficial to containing environmental degradation. But later on, the African countries recognized the need to shift from allocation and exploitation to long-term sustainability of natural resources. That's why you see the 1968 Algiers Convention, which now is turned into the revised Maputo Convention, which brings in a lot of sustainability. At continental and regional levels, you see so many of those conventions, the Bamako, the Abuja Charter on Human Rights, the Lome Charter on Marine of 2016, Bamako, the Abuja Treaty, and the rest, and so on. Those regional instruments, the trend we see in most of these instruments is that they are showing some good level of modern environmental law at the continental level, which is integrating environmental issues with socio-economic, security, and political agenda. That's one of the reasons why I agree with Justice Emmanuel that in Africa, the trend is that the two, development and environment, are not in opposing issues. As I had said, my concentration is on trends, and therefore it is instructive to go and look at the national level after seeing the regional trends. At the national level, generally, we see trends of development of national laws. The trend is that it also at national level is going in tandem with the development agenda. There is no question about it. Therefore, to the extent that the quest for economic growth and also the response to environmental challenges and pressures has shaped all the national laws very fundamentally to that level. Going back again to historical aspects is that if you look at the independence constitutions of the 1960s and the sectoral environmental laws, national laws, they were also, of course, heavily influenced by the colonial tenets of allocation and exploitation. But this trend, the modern trend now, is that we are seeing more of these laws taking the sustainability development pathway. If you see in the 1980s and 1990s, most of African countries progressively developed and implemented modern constitutions, framework and sectoral laws and policies to a very varying degrees in terms of structure and substance, which I will shortly go into them now. However, what we see is that most of the 1980s, 1990s, and current trends, they are moving away from exploitation. They are having sustainability management provisions, preventive and restoration approaches. We see, for example, in most of the African constitutions, legal frameworks and sectoral laws, they are placing more emphasis on distribution of power to the subnational levels, to the states, to the citizens. Most constitutions in Africa, I think there are over 30, which have placed a duty on the state for protection of the environment. and also defined the duties of the citizens in the protection of the environment. The provisions for the protection of the environment is featured in different wordings: a healthy environment as a human right, right to live in a healthy and unpolluted environment, right to water, right to food, duty to protect the environment, impact assessment, and all those aspects of this. We're also seeing a lot of provisions for dispute resolutions mechanisms in environmental matters, including access to justice, locus standi, and all those other ones which are there. Public trust over forests, wetlands, and water bodies, and so on and so on. However, we are also seeing currently, at least in one country, where we are beginning to see the development of integrated regulations using integrated approach, of which my sister Pamela was talking about. There's a country which I will not mention because they are still developing that regulation, and of which we are as UNEP assisting that country, in which they are using an integrated approach, legal integrated approach, to implement those dichotomies and nexuses which the previous speakers have been talking about, to implement a national environment framework law. We'll see how that one comes out, because I think it is going to solve what the issues which have been talked over by previous speakers on how to deal with integrated approach, interlinkages of laws and natural resources or environment issues. We're also seeing a lot of environmental activism, especially in the development of national legislation. I've seen in one country where an NGO is the one which is developing a national law, which was a little bit surprising to me, but there we are, because you can see the NGO taking over the role of the state, of government to develop national legislation. And I think that is a trend which will also continue in the future. I thought it was also pertinent to bring around the issues of water and areas of climate change and others, because from where I sit, I see a lot happening around the continent. If you look at the water law, Africa's water laws, they're analyzed, they can be seen from two angles. That is from the transboundary basins, through the treaties, agreements, protocols, and so on, and of course at the national level. A discussion has been made on the 63 shared basins in Africa, which is roughly around 64% of the continent of Africa, and Africa with 34 international agreements out of 145 international agreements, global agreements, which are made between two or more countries. What we are seeing on the African continent of these regional or transboundary agreements is that all the agreements in Africa are showing they're dealing with the withdrawal and in-stream water uses. A few are dealing with the ecosystem or the basin-wide approach. And I think that is because of the times when those agreements were made. However, we're also seeing that most of the water agreements have centered on creativity in their formulation, meeting the hydrological, economic, political, and cultural settings of individual basins. I'll give the example of where I'm sitting now. We are also seeing most of the water agreements are having multi-sectoral linkages or interlinkages with the broader issues of deforestation, peace, and so on. Then when we go at national level, we see the current trends in water law showing especially reversing trends of overconsumption, pollution, and recognition of water as an economic good. The role of women, water conservation, water rights, and so on, they are there. There are a number of countries who have developed wetlands resource legislation as subsidiary legislation permitting and regulating wetlands. We're also seeing many countries with coastal countries, especially coastal and marine legislation, including that of Sierra Leone, and we expect this trend to continue on and on. Because of time limitation, I will not go into the climate change, but suffice to say that modern climate change laws are also bringing in the interlinkages which have been talked about between the different aspects of climate change, legal interventions, and so on, which are there. As a way of conclusion, I will avoid to mention the trends in jurisprudence or in the courts of law because of time, but as a way of conclusion is that the future of Africa is going to rely on the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement, and there is a need for the continent to develop a protocol on environmental goods and services in Africa. It should come in as fast as possible as other protocols for the continental area which are developing, so as to help protect the environment and also to enable the continent to trade in environmental goods and services for the benefit of the continent. I thank you, and I will stop.
Merci beaucoup pour tous les intervenants qui ont progressivement enrichi chacun le débat avec des aspects qui se sont complétés et qui nous ont permis d'avoir une approche véritablement globale, sans oublier aucun des aspects, en partant du tandem au changement climatique, désertification et les questions du développement, en intégrant tout ce qui est sécurité alimentaire, santé, démographie, pollution et les impacts des changements climatiques sur l'économie et le risque de ne pouvoir atteindre les objectifs du développement durable. Ensuite, nous avons eu des éléments importants sur les questions du lien entre le droit à et la question de l'environnement, de l'eau et changement climatique. Nous parlons du droit à l'eau, mais nous parlons aussi du droit à l'environnement, avec tout ce que cela suppose au niveau conceptuel, mais aussi au niveau de l'effectivité de ce droit et du rapport aux populations et aux communautés qui ont ce besoin qui est essentiel. Et donc les avancées sur le plan aussi bien international que des pays sur la consécration de ce droit. Évidemment, la question de la justiciabilité a été plusieurs fois remise sur le tapis. Nous avons aussi écouté des éléments très importants sur la résilience et sur l'évolution du droit de l'environnement. Et j'ai apprécié en fin de conférence cet aspect sur les eaux transfrontières qui nous interpelle sur la question des résolutions des conflits et sur le droit international à nouveau pour véritablement anticiper les conflits et faire de l'eau et de l'environnement un cadre de coopération, un cadre de régulation, et puis avoir des institutions qui soient adaptées au contexte africain et aux besoins des pays de l'Afrique. Voilà ce que j'ai retenu de manière très résumée, et je m'excuse si j'ai omis des aspects, mais le temps ne me permet pas de revenir sur tout ce qui a été dit. Merci à vous tous. Je voudrais savoir si M. Mamadou Diallo voudrait prendre la parole.
Oui, merci bien, Houria. Merci à vous tous. Je voudrais tout d'abord féliciter le président de la Commission mondiale du droit de l'environnement, le juge Antonio Benjamin, les membres de son comité directeur et les autorités du pays hôte, le Maroc, pour l'organisation de cette édition du Congrès africain du droit de l'environnement. Je leur exprime ma gratitude pour m'avoir associé au Congrès et particulièrement à ce panel que vous avez dirigé brillamment. Je voudrais vous remercier particulièrement, remercier aussi le juge Emmanuel, professeur Pedi, Robert Wabunoha du PNIE et docteur Kibugi pour leurs interventions que vous avez résumées tout à l'heure. Je sais que c'est de brillantes interventions, même si pour certains d'entre eux, je n'ai pas eu la chance de les écouter du fait de la technologie. Mais comme vous le savez tous, le thème qui nous est proposé, droit de l'environnement au changement climatique, tendance générale et défis en Afrique, est un thème d'actualité, un thème très pertinent pour l'Afrique. Les problématiques majeures qui nous interpellent aujourd'hui et qui vont continuer à interpeller le monde, surtout l'Afrique, sont la crise de l'eau et la crise du climat. Ça, tout le monde y convient. L'eau, source de vie, mais aussi source de conflits d'usage au niveau national, comme aussi au niveau international, avec les cours d'eau transfrontières, mais également, même au niveau des pays, l'accès à l'eau pose problème, l'eau propre à la consommation pose problème. Tout cela, ça constitue des problématiques qui vont interpeller le continent, et il faudrait normalement que l'eau et surtout les cours d'eau partagés soient normalement des sources de coopération entre les différents pays, sources de cohabitation pacifique entre les différents citoyens d'un pays, mais on constate qu'il y a beaucoup de conflits. Il s'y ajoute que l'eau devient de plus en plus inaccessible, ou si elle est impropre à la consommation du fait de la dégradation de sa qualité par d'autres usagers. Je pense aux pollueurs que sont les orpailleurs clandestins qui utilisent des produits chimiques comme le mercure et le cyanure et qui déversent leurs déchets dans des cours d'eau internationaux. Je pense à la Falémé et le fleuve Sénégal, qui sont aujourd'hui complètement pollués, et les États sont confrontés à ce problème parce qu'il y va de la santé des populations, mais également il y va de l'écosystème particulier que constitue la Falémé. Il y va des éleveurs qui n'ont plus une eau propre pour leur cheptel. Il y va des populations elles-mêmes, pour l'agriculture, pour l'élevage, pour la pêche. Toutes ces activités économiques sont aujourd'hui remises en cause par ces pollueurs. Donc, c'est des conflits en latence qui sont là aujourd'hui et c'est une bombe à retardement. Et seul aujourd'hui, le droit international de l'environnement peut aider à concilier les différentes parties prenantes. Il est impérieux donc de faire appel au droit international de l'environnement et aux juges de l'environnement. Tous les intervenants l'ont souligné. Il est heureux que le droit à un environnement sain soit consacré dans bien de constitutions africaines. L'accès à la justice, surtout par les acteurs de la société civile environnementale, est aussi reconnu, même si son effectivité est encore très timide. Il ne faut pas cependant désespérer, d'où le rôle extrêmement important que doivent jouer la Commission mondiale des droits de l'environnement. J'espère que le président m'entend très bien, mais surtout l'UICN et les associations de défense de l'environnement, de même que les lanceurs d'alerte, pour faire en sorte que ces thématiques soient des thématiques d'actualité, que la Commission puisse les prendre en charge effectivement au niveau national comme également au niveau international. Voilà brièvement ce que je voulais dire en vous remerciant encore une fois Houria, mais aussi en remerciant Benjamin, Antonio Benjamin, que je vois bien à l'écran. Et encore une fois, je le remercie. C'est quelqu'un en tout cas pour qui j'ai beaucoup d'estime et c'est réciproque, il m'estime beaucoup. Et à chaque fois qu'il y a une activité de ce genre, Vraiment, nous sommes impliqués et ça, nous lui en sommes très reconnaissants. Nous le félicitons, nous l'encourageons et nous félicitons également tous ceux qui sont autour de lui pour faire en sorte que ce congrès, cette édition soit un succès plus que ceux qui sont passés. Merci bien, Houria.
Merci,
Président
Diallo.
Benjamin.
Je dirais quand même qu'il y a un travail de régulation, mais un travail de gouvernance, de mettre en œuvre des gouvernances adaptées. Et nous n'avons pas suffisamment parlé de la question de financement. Et c'est une question qui est très importante. Je pense qu'elle viendra plus tard. Si vous me donnez 2 secondes, je voudrais vous lire une phrase prononcé dans un des discours de Sa Majesté pour que vous voyez l'importance qui est donnée à l'eau au Maroc. Dans son discours de 2018, notre roi a dit « Notre souci constant d'améliorer la situation sociale générale et de relever les défis économiques n'a d'égal que notre engagement actif à préserver et à valoriser les ressources stratégiques de notre pays. En la matière, au premier chef, l'eau joue un rôle clé dans la dynamique de développement et dans la préservation de la stabilité. » Voilà, c'est le discours qui a été dit par Sa Majesté en 2018 à l'occasion de la fête du trône. Bien, je vous remercie tous pour vos interventions. Je remercie Monsieur Antonio, que j'ai le plaisir de connaître aujourd'hui. J'espère qu'on deviendra amis, nous aussi, puisque vous êtes amis avec tout le monde. J'ai bien connu les UCN à un certain moment. Et voilà, je vous félicite pour cet important événement et je crois que cet atelier nous a fourni beaucoup d'éléments pour faire des propositions concrètes qui amélioreraient le cadre juridique aussi bien au niveau des pays qu'au niveau international. À vous la parole.